Good evening, everyone. My name is Ryan Marable, president of the National Pharmaceutical Association, and I want to express my genuine appreciation for everyone for joining us this evening for this pre-convention continuing education session, closing out a two-part series for pre-conference. Today's event will be focused on parliamentary procedures presented by speakers Dr. Kendrea Jones and Dr. Terry Moore. Once again, this is a pre-convention CPE session. If you have not registered for this conference that's coming up in less than 14 days, please visit www.mpha.net to get registered. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to our website at mpha.net or anyone from the board of directors. And without further ado, I will be passing the microphone to one of our speakers, Dr. Terry Moore.
Thank you so much, President Marble, and good evening, everyone. I'm truly excited that we're all going to be seeing each other really soon to conduct not only the business of our organization, but to have some fun and network and socialize after being absent from one another for the past couple of years. So tonight we are going to spend time preparing you either as delegates and also just as members of the association on parliamentary procedures. And so just to give Kendrea and I a sense of what we're dealing with, would you put in the chat the answer to the following question? How would you rate your understanding of parliamentary procedure and Robert's Rules of Order on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the highest? So ready, set, go. Put your answers in the chat, please. Okay, 7, 6, 3, 5, 6, 5, 7. Okay. And just, that's good, because we're all learning more and more about parliamentary procedures. So wherever you are, there's always opportunities to learn more, and that's part of what we're going to do this evening. My second really quick question: what topics about parliamentary procedure do you want to better understand? Real short answers, please. What would you really say, gosh, if I could really understand this tonight, this is what I would want to understand? Motions and opening discussions, rescinding and amending motions, secondary motions. Okay. All right. All exceptions to rules. Okay. There are always exceptions to rules, but it's how we go about those exceptions. Okay, so this gives us a good sense. There's a lot of interest in wanting to better understand and learn more about all aspects of motions. And we're going to do as much as we can to cover some of your questions. However, I will say that during the NPHA meeting, both Kendrea and I will be available. If outside of the house sessions, you will want to stop us if you have any questions or want clarifications on things that we may not get to tonight, then feel free to stop us. We'll make ourselves available. So with that, let's start our show. Kendrea.
Just kind of, as Terry said, I'm Kendrea Jones. I'm actually the parliamentarian for the board of NPHA. And as she mentioned, we will be available at the national meeting. And then we are working hard on some documents to provide for our delegates that Dr. Riley will send out early next week to prepare you guys for participation in the House of Delegates. We do not have any conflicts of interest to disclose. I'll share this slide again at the end, but just as a reminder for CE credit, it has your evaluation must be completed within 30 days, and then credit will be awarded within 60 days. If you have any questions about the CE credit, please reach out to Dr. Raven Jackson. Here's the link, and we will get this, Ryan, if you will, I'll try to send this to you, and if you'll drop it in the chat, we'll get in the chat at the end of the session. So here are the objectives for tonight. We're going to define the purpose of parliamentary procedure. We're going to look at the ranking and types of motions required for a formal House of Delegates. So hopefully that will help with some of the questions about how we bring business in front of the delegates or in a formal meeting. We'll talk about some of the common mistakes during a formal meeting or of the House or the House of Delegates, and then we'll talk about some of the voting options. One of the tools we'll provide actually breaks it down into here's the most common motions, and then what's required from the standpoint of a 2/3 versus a majority vote, and if it requires a second or not. So we have some tools that we'll provide to any of the delegates that will be serving in the House. So when we look at just the purpose of parliamentary procedure, I think most of us are familiar with parliamentary procedure and Robert's rules. But if you really look at it, it really is to facilitate the transaction of business. It helps us maintain orderly manner, and then it allows us to be able to consider one subject at a time. So it really allows us to operate with some structure and actually move the business of our organization forward more quickly. And the hope is that it will promote cooperation and harmony. It also ensures that all members have equal rights, privileges, and obligations. One of the things that I always like to highlight is when you look at, parliamentary procedure, when we observe the rules, it honors the will and rights of the majority. But I think this is a really, really important part to highlight, is that it does ensure and protect the rights of the minority. So it really gives everybody a voice in the decisions that occur within a body or assembly. When we look at parliamentary procedure, we really want to think about, it really is the rules that will limit and guide and protect the individual. This is also really important. The decision you make within a board or the delegates or an assembly must be correct. It may not be correct, but each decision must be made in a correct manner. And I really think this is where, Robert's rules really guides us. We always like to highlight that most people are familiar with Robert's Rules of Order. There are other guidance documents around parliamentary procedure, but it's the most widely used. And we are now at the 12th edition that's readily available through like Amazon and places like that if you're interested in picking up a copy. There's also a condensed version as well. When we look at our governing bodies, our governing documents, we have federal and state and local laws. We commonly will see charters or articles of incorporation. We have constitutions. Of course, our organization heavily runs based on our bylaws. Many times you'll also see that there's rules of orders or some sort of standing rules or procedures. It's not uncommon for those to be alongside bylaws. Our administrative policies and procedures, and then our customs. I will say, our bylaws and nominations committee has really been working on refining our bylaws. And I think some of our next steps will be looking at some of our admin policies and procedures, and then standing rules and procedures. When we look at our bylaws and how they interact with Robert's rules, really the big thing to remember is our bylaws are really what really governs our organization. These are legally binding, and then sometimes they can override that parliamentary authority, especially when it's really clearly written in the bylaws what is the manner or procedure that should be followed. So when we look at just basic principles of a meeting and just covering that to begin, when we really think about it, right, we all know the term quorum, right? So a quorum must be present for a meeting to start and really for the assembly to act. So for us to actually move business forward and make decisions, one of the first things we'll do within the meeting is actually assess, do we have quorum? The quorum is usually defined by the bylaws, and if it's not clear, then it usually defers to the majority of the membership. One of the other things to remember is that we really want to, only one question or topic should be considered at any given time. And so we're going to talk about the ranking of motions that help guide that. Particularly in the House of Delegates, and really if you think about any formal meeting, there's some sort of presiding officer. Within the House of Delegates, we have a chair, and really no member should be speaking until recognized by the chair. So we will discuss, particularly in the House of Delegates, when you're trying to bring business before the assembly, how you want to start that, what you should be doing as far as introducing yourself to be recognized. And really the chair is going to maintain some sort of strict impartiality during the discussion. So you'll notice Dr. Riley within our House of Delegates, you will not hear her comment on whether or not she is for or against a resolution or any business within the House. So quorum. Quorum is really a minimum number of members that are really necessary to conduct business. Like I stated, this is usually within the bylaws. In the House of Delegates, so I think it's always important to point out, how do we run the NPHA organization? So when you look at our House of Delegates and the bylaws, really what we state is that a simple majority of the number of elected delegates. So normally what we would have is 50 delegates, and so the majority would be 26. We also have a contingency plan if for some reason we don't fill the House of Delegates. So if the House of Delegates does not fill, then we look at total registration for the annual meeting, and we determine what 20% of that would be. And so that's of our active life and retired members who are registered for the annual meeting. Usually what we're going to start with is a roll call. So that basically says, everyone who's present and do we have quorum? At any point when quorum ceases to exist, really business has to stop. And so I think this is really important too, as you guys are looking at the schedule for the national meeting. You want to plan to be a part of the House of Delegates and remain in the House of Delegates for the entire time. Only motions in order are, when we look at the motions, as far as if we lose quorum, we can recess until quorum returns, or a motion to adjourn. And so again, really, really important to look at the NPHA meeting schedule and make sure you have plans to be available and participate in the full House of Delegates. So quick polling question. You guys are free to put your answers in the chat. So meetings run more smoothly when parliamentary procedure is utilized. Is this true or false? Terry, I may need your assistance. Some kind of way I lost my chat box.
Okay, looks like we have a lot of A's and trues. So I think people have gotten this one. Would you like to show the correct answer though?
If I can get my, hold on, technical difficulties.
There we go.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Okay, second polling question. Quorum means the minimum number of members needed for business item to pass.
True or false? Ah.
Oh, we've got some.
We have some interesting answers here.
Ew.
Please carefully read. Well, okay, let's
me
keep it
read the
moving.
question for you guys, right? So quorum means the minimum number of members needed for a business item to pass. So feel free if you still will agree with that answer. No need to change. Let's see, I've got some more comments coming in. All right, I see people are.
Got it.
Right.
Okay. And I'll just comment here. Are we ready to show the answer?
Yes, there we go.
Yeah, the answer is false. And oftentimes people think that the quorum determines what is needed to pass an action. And that's not at all true. And when we talk about voting a little bit later and what constitutes the needed number of votes for a business item to pass, it's different. Quorum is just what we need in order to start the meeting and to conduct business.
Okay, so we're going to move on and start talking about classes of motions. We'll spend some time discussing main motions, the types of subsidiary motions, and then privileged motions. Of course, there are some non-ranking motions. And so these are motions that bring the questions again before the assembly. And then we'll also talk about incidental motions. And so our goal with this section is really to try to discuss, particularly when there's multiple motions on the floor, how they rank, right? So which one should we address first before we address maybe an additional motion that's on the floor?
I would just like to interject that there are probably a total of 30 different types of motions. And so in parliamentary procedure, they are put in certain categories, which determines when a certain motion can be considered and how certain motions rank higher, and they then will take precedence over whatever business is happening. And so we want to just give you some sense of that. It's a lot to really understand all of the 30 different types of motions. And only parliamentarians really try and understand that because a lot of the motions aren't ones that are commonly used. But we do want to give you some sense of the different motions and their rankings, because there is power in understanding that.
So this slide is just displaying very similar to what Terry was discussing, just those priority rankings. It's important to recognize that a privileged motion is going to have the highest ranking. So I think we have some diagrams on the next couple of slides that really show kind of a pyramid and give some examples around those motions. Can everybody see this slide fairly well? So what this is basically showing on the right-hand side of the screen is the type of motion. As I stated, privileged motions have the highest priority, with our main motions having the lowest priority. So when we look at a privileged motion, really that has to do with motions that are concerning the conduct of the assembly's business, whereas a main motion would be actually concerning the substance of a question. When we look at like our subsidiary motions, these are motions that concern the rights of the assembly members. And so we have some slides that will give some examples of these. We also have incidental motions. And so these usually concern the disposition of other motions. And then I think the other one just to remember is that there are motions that will actually bring business back before the assembly or the board. And so that's important also to remember. So motion types, incidentals really deal more with the questions of a procedure, right? So when we think about these motions, we're usually thinking about a pending motion or business at hand. These are commonly not debatable. So when we provide you guys, we have a chart that we provide. And so it will have a column that says debatable or non-debatable. It also has, again, what's needed for that to pass. And also provide some language as to how you bring that before the House of Delegates. So the motions that fall within this category, or at least the common ones, would be to withdraw a motion, rise to a point of order, call for a division of the House, and we'll talk about just the way in which we vote, particularly when that motion is placed on the floor. And then division of the question is the other one that's commonly utilized or seen as an incidental motion. Guys, sorry, I'm having like a lag time between slides moving forward. Okay, privileged. These are immediate importance, right? They don't always relate, they do not relate to pending business. They are not debatable. So these are things like to adjourn, to recess, raising a question of privilege, even calling for the order of the day would be considered a privileged motion. Followed by a subsidiary motion. And so these really assist in treating or what we do to dispose a main motion. So these do require a second. These can be debatable. So again, some of these are not. And so we will provide a chart that clearly identifies which motions are debatable versus not. I think the important thing to remember with these is that many of these require a majority vote, but there are some that require 2/3 votes. So for example, call for the previous question This comes up in the House of Delegates probably every year, and that is limiting or extending of debate. So we commonly, just from a timing perspective, you will notice, particularly in the second House of Delegates, we will have to discuss limiting debate so that we can discuss all the business that's on the agenda. Other examples, of course, are to amend, call the question, refer to committee, and then postpone indefinitely. So
Before
quick
we
poll.
go-
Terry,
before
you
we
want to
go-
go back and cover any of those?
Yeah, before we go on to the knowledge check, let me just maybe recap and thank you so much, Kendrea, because this is a lot to understand these different types of motions. But the fundamental motion that starts moving business in front of the assembly is the main motion. And of the ranking motions, it is the lowest one. It's the one that basically starts the conversation. It brings the business to the assembly. And then the subsidiary motions are the next higher ranking one, because those tend to focus on, as it's stated here, what we do to treat or dispose of a main motion. So if you want to amend the motion or refer it to a committee, but that's where the real heart of the debate and the discussion of the motion, the main motion, happens. Your privilege motions, interestingly, are ones that are the highest ranking, because those, as it says here, they are put in place when there's something of immediate importance that needs to happen. Someone, for example, comes in to a meeting, let's say, comes into a meeting and or maybe there's like an emergency and all of a sudden the meeting has to go into recess. Well, even if there's a main motion that's being discussed, the presiding officer can call for the meeting to go into recess. Or let's say there's a debate going and the conversation is not on the topic of the main motion. There's just a lot of other topics that are being brought up. And to bring things on track, the call for the orders of the day is an immediate motion that can interrupt that derailed agenda to bring things back into order, to bring things back into on the agenda. So your privilege motions are really, I call them the ones that really kind of help minimize the chaos that oftentimes can happen. And then, of course, I mean, there's some other ones, but just to kind of keep that perspective, and those ranking motions all rise up from the main motion. And if you go back one more slide, Kendrea, when you talk about the incidental motions, those are in the category of what are called non-ranking motions, because they don't have the order of what's called precedence in parliamentary procedure that the other ranking motions do. They're important motions, but they can be brought up as a situation requires, without having to be burdened with whether they gain or deserve higher recognition. So just wanted to, kind of clarify or recap that, because that's very important. And as Kendrea said, when you see the chart that you will get that will outline these motions a little bit more, hopefully these types and the various priorities and rankings will help. So let's go to the knowledge question, I think was next. So when a meeting is going off track, not following the agenda, which motion is in order? And then what is the ranking of that motion? So it's a two-part question. So when the meeting is going off track and not following the agenda, which motion is in order and what is the ranking of that motion? And you can, let's see, I see must be a privilege to be not acknowledged. I see the motion is call for the order of the day. It's a privilege motion, order of the day, call for the order of the day, and it's a privilege motion. Okay, let's go show the answer. And there it is. Yes, the motion that when the agenda is not being followed is a call for the day, and it's a privilege motion. And what that means is, with it being for the orders of the day, it's a motion that can be stated without being recognized by the presiding officer. You can state it by interrupting the presiding office by calling for the orders of the day. It doesn't require any sort of vote. It is stated by a member to bring the meeting back into order, and it is considered, as stated here, a privilege motion. Any questions at this point?
Noble, did you have a question around, was that comment within the chat an actual question?
Someone said, what happens if it's if it is ignored? There are things, if it's ignored, that's basically the chair not following the proper procedures. It's kind of the chair's subtle way of making a decision. And if at any time when the chair makes a decision and the assembly wants to appeal the chair's decision, there is an incidental motion that is called an appeal for the chair's decision. So a member, in the case where the call for order is being ignored, can again interrupt the presiding officer with a motion to appeal the chair's decision or action. It requires a second, and then it would be taken to a vote. Now, if it continues to be out of hand and the presiding officer is still not following proper procedure, that's where the parliamentarian is there to help the presiding officer to realize what they're doing and how that's not helping the situation. And hopefully a sidebar conversation will bring things back on track. I hope that answers that question. It can't be ignored. Some presiding officers do, but technically they're not supposed to ignore those sort of privileged decisions.
Right. So Noble, hopefully that answers your question, is that it should be acknowledged.
The next slide.
Terry, you want to cover procedures for handling a main motion?
Yes, I'll proceed with this. And I apologize, everyone. I don't know if I adequately introduced myself, but I'm Terry Moore. I'm a member of NPHA, and I'm also a registered parliamentarian. And I serve as parliamentarian for other organizations, but within NPHA, Kendrea is the parliamentarian, and I just serve as an advisor to her. And I also am a member of the Bylaws and Resolutions Committee. So here, procedures for handling main motions. And this is where members have the power. So to bring an item of business to the assembly, as the member, you want to rise, stand formally. In some settings, standing up is not required. You at least want to raise your hand. You want to get acknowledged by the chair. And then you want to address the presiding officer, depending on their position, as either president, chairperson, speaker of the house. You want to address them. And then when the chair recognizes you, you will state, I move that, or I move to, and you state your motion. And what goes in that blank can be almost anything. When that motion is made, then there needs to be a second. The member who makes the second doesn't necessarily have to stand or be recognized. They can just state, I second the motion. Sometimes for shorthand, people will just say second. I tend to advise people to speak in full sentences. So to say, I second the motion, it just minimizes confusion. But if the motion, and so when the person, if it's an individual member that says, I second the motion, what they are basically saying is, I agree with considering this motion. They're not saying that they agree or disagree with the content of the motion. They're just saying, I'm okay with moving forward with discussing it. And as Noble put in the chat, I second that emotion. Okay. That's a good old Motown song. Anyway, back to this. But oftentimes, motions are brought to an assembly by a committee. And we're going to talk a little bit more about committees because when committees give their reports, they oftentimes will include a recommendation, something that they want the assembly to take action on. And so if a committee brings a motion to the assembly, that motion does not need a second. But that's the only step in the process that's different. Once a committee brings up a motion, then it proceeds with the presiding officer opening the floor for discussion or debate, and then the appropriate voting at the appropriate time. There's a question from Dr. Tuckett. Isn't it a good practice to also identify yourself, name and zone? In the case of NPHA and our House of Delegates, it's a large assembly, and it is very helpful for record keeping for you to identify yourself by name and also your zone. And that's, as Terrence put in there, yes, for record and for minutes. It's very, very helpful to identify yourself.
One of the documents that you guys will receive will have some of that information in it. We have almost like a rules of procedure for the NPHA House of Delegates. And so it will also cover the agenda items and how we bring the agenda forward as well. So there'll be some additional tip sheets for you guys to utilize within the House of Delegates.
So then proceeding through the steps, and it's important to recognize that the chair of the assembly does have certain roles and responsibilities. There's certain things that the chair is the one that should be saying, not the committee chair, not the, not a member who initiated the motion, but it is up to the chair. And here's a point, an example, where it is the chair who says, once a motion has been moved and seconded, to say it has been moved by, and give the name, and then seconded by that, and then they repeat the motion. Something I see often when a committee brings a recommendation, and in their report, if there is a recommendation, they should conclude their report by saying something like, on behalf of the party committee, we move that we have a party every month except in December. And because it doesn't need a second, sometimes the chair of that committee will just go ahead and say, okay, are there any questions or discussion? And that's not really the role of that chair. That committee chair should yield the floor back to the presiding officer. And it's kind of confusing sometimes when we see chair, but in this case, it's the presiding officer that should repeat the motion and initiate debate. So then if it's a motion that is debatable, every member has the right to debate unless it's stated in, let's say in some organizations where there's a House of Delegates, sometimes it's stated that only delegates can exercise the right to debate or to speak. And that again, just depends on the organization. But if it's debatable, those members who have the right to debate have the right to speak up pro or con or ask any questions. It's really important that the chair refrain, or the presiding officer refrains from participating in that debate. And I know it's tempting to a lot of presiding officers to give their kind of preference or their opinion. The proposer of the motion has the first right to debate. The debate or the discussion must be related to that motion. That's where you don't want to go off talking about other topics. And then it's also during that time where subsidiary motions may be introduced. That's the time where if someone wants to amend that main motion, they present a motion to amend. And to go through how they want to amend it, whether it's to strike some language that's in the original main motion, or to add something to the original main motion, or to delete some wording, or to add a whole new paragraph or sentence. Those are all various ways of amending the main motion, but that happens during this discussion and debate period. And then once all of that has happened, and there's no further discussion, the presiding officer typically then would repeat the motion. I do see something in the chat about amend versus friendly amendment. Friendly amendment is not really an appropriate term in parliamentary procedure because oftentimes people have used the term friendly amendment, meaning I want to make sure that the maker of the motion is okay with me amending this. Once a motion is made and seconded, it belongs to the assembly. It no longer belongs to that individual. And so there's really no need to go back to the maker of the motion and ask or suggest a friendly amendment. Now, I will sometimes say to people, yeah, be friendly, be nice about your amendment. But the term friendly amendment is really not an official parliamentary procedure term. Next slide, if there are no further questions or comments. Kendra, would you like to go through this, since this is really appropriate for the House of which you are the parliamentarian?
Yeah, I can go through this. So you guys will receive this in our rules of procedure, but this just really highlights for the NPHA House of Delegates what our rules of debate are. So NAFA or NPHA members and attendees can argue for or against a resolution or an amendment. So we focus this really heavily around our resolutions. You guys will, if you participate in the House before, a large portion of our business has to do with resolutions, and we've done a C presentation on that. If you missed that, that will also be shared with our delegates as well. Speakers are limited to 3 minutes each, and so we don't have a limit on the number of times an individual can speak to the question, but we do have a standing rule that no person may speak more than once until all others have had the opportunity to speak. So you want to yield the floor to others, and then you may come back and continue to discuss, and if you have additional discussion around those who are already speaking or have spoke. Motions to stop or limit debate, just as a reminder, do require that 2/3 vote. We highlight that just because we know that comes up year after year within the House. And then to stop debate and move towards a vote, you want to call for the previous question. And so this will, of course, limit or extend the debate. And so you want to state the motion as such. And so in our charts that we provide, we actually go through call for the previous question as well as to limit debate. We also talk about postponing indefinitely versus just postponing to a certain time period, which those are some common motions that we normally have within our House of Delegates. Any questions about just the rules of debate? Since many of you guys will be serving in the House in just another week or so. Okay. Terry, I can cover voting as well. So from a voting perspective, go
I was going
ahead.
to say, there's some more slides later on voting. But if you want to start it here, and then I'll pick up with the next slides.
Okay. So as we talk about voting, so just to kind of recap, right? So we have brought a motion to the floor. It has been seconded. And then we've had discussion, and then the chair has called for the vote. And so many times the chair is going to say all those in favor of, and they will state the motion. And we will commonly do a voice vote. Or if you're opposed, you would say no. So we're going to talk in a couple of slides just around voice vote versus ballot vote, the different types of voting when we use those. If a motion requires a 2/3 vote, we usually ask for rising or by show of hands. And we should always, so the chair is going to always ask for those that are opposed. And so I think that's also sometimes a mistake, is especially if the ayes have it, we can sometimes tend to forget to ask for, are there any that are opposed? And so that's just something to remember. What should also happen is the result of the vote should be stated by the chair. So the motion is carried or the motion is lost. If the vote is actually counted, we really should give a number on both sides. And so those who are in favor, those who were against or opposed, and actually state the number. So particularly for those times where we have a ballot vote, we want to make sure the number is provided.
Before you leave the voting, just want to make before you leave that, just want to make two comments. Oftentimes people or the presiding officer will say, all those in favor say aye, and then we'll say those opposed, like sign. Well, like sign means, do you want people to say aye, or do you want them to say no? So I advise presiding officers to be really clear that if they want people to say aye, if they're in favor, and then ask them to say no when they're opposed. Another thing with voting is abstentions. Abstentions are not really votes. It just gives you a sense that there are people who are choosing to not vote one way or another. To me, it's okay to ask for abstentions just to gauge if there are people who are not making a decision, but they do not count in the vote. So when you're counting your whether a vote has passed or not, it's counting on the basis of the number who actually did vote. And so abstentions don't get added, and that's oftentimes a point of confusion. And that's particularly clear or important when you're doing voting using a ballot.
The other thing to just highlight, this is also not the time that you scream your aye or that you're in favor versus not. You should just utilize your normal voice and not from the standpoint of make it confusing for us to determine if the ayes have it or the noes have it.
Okay. So the next slide is just to recap some commonly used motions. And again, some of these will be in the chart that you will get as delegates and I guess members as well. But we talked about your main motion. We've talked about amending. These are very, very commonly used motions. Point of order is, again, where if there is something that the presiding officer is doing that is not following parliamentary procedure, a member can speak out and say, point of order. Let's say, for example, it's been agreed that debate is only going to last for 3 minutes, and the presiding officer is letting people talk 5 and 6 and 8 minutes. Then someone can interrupt and say, point of order, because the presiding officer is not following what the assembly agreed on as the rules. That's different from parliamentary inquiry, where you may have a question or you want some clarification from the presiding officer. And so the motion there is parliamentary, calling for parliamentary inquiry. Both of those point of order and parliamentary inquiry are ones where you can actually interrupt the presiding officer to get the attention and make your case. In the case of parliamentary inquiry, once you have interrupted the presiding officer and have the floor, then you ask the question, whatever it is that you want to get clarification on. Another commonly used motion is to commit or refer. This is when there's been a lot of debate and the assembly seems to be unready or unready or not at a point that they feel comfortable voting on a motion. Then a member can make a motion to commit or refer. What that means is the matter of the motion will go to either an existing committee, or it might be moved to establish a new committee to then take this motion, the item of this motion back and have the committee do the necessary research or refinement to the motion. Previous question, as Kendrea said, is commonly used as a way to stop debate, but it has to be done properly. Oftentimes people will just blurt out, call for the question, as if that brings everything to a halt. It doesn't quite bring it to a halt. It just says that you want to stop debate. It does require a second, and then it requires the assembly to vote. Because again, when you look at why do we have parliamentary procedure? To give the right to everyone having a voice. And if someone says they really want to continue the debate before voting, this gives them an opportunity to not have the debate closed. Postpone to a certain time is one that commonly people don't use. They will state a motion, they'll call out, I want to table this, or the proper terminology is to lay on the table. And what they are intending is to say, can we take this up at another time? The proper motion, when you want to take the motion and defer it to another time, is to state the motion as postpone this motion to a certain time. That is the way of stopping the debate at this point in time and then saying, when are we going to bring it up again? That postpone to a certain time might be another session in the case of a House of Delegates that might have multiple sessions, or it may be postponed to the next regular meeting of an assembly. But that's the proper way of moving a motion, moving a discussion to another time. When you say lay on the table, that's used when something has interrupted the discussion and you need to stop the discussion to tend to this immediate action. An example is like you're in a meeting, you're talking about a motion, and your national president comes in and says, I only have 5 minutes. I really need to speak to the assembly. Then the chair can call for a motion to lay that discussion on the table. The national officer, whoever gives their 5 minute, whatever, interrupted. And when that's done, then another motion is made to bring that item off of the table and continue the discussion. So that's that distinction is something that's important to understand. And there's another one that oftentimes dealing with postponement, people will use the motion postpone indefinitely. And what that means is you basically are saying, we don't want to deal with this motion anymore. So if you want to kill a motion totally, then you make the motion to postpone indefinitely. It does require a second. It can be debated. It does have to be voted on, but it's a way of totally abandoning a motion and killing it versus postpone to a certain time. Those are the two motions that deal with postponement. And another commonly one is the motion to adjourn. And it is up to the assembly oftentimes to for there to be a vote to adjourn. It depends on how the meeting was set up, and how the presiding officer handles adjournment. But an adjournment is something that, again, someone from the membership can make a motion to adjourn at any time. And if it's seconded and there's a vote, a majority vote, then the meeting will be or is to be adjourned. Those are common motions. And we'll talk about 2/3 versus majority. Okay. Next slide. We'll get to that on voting, because I want to cover just some common pitfalls or mistakes that you want to avoid when you're in an assembly. So as I mentioned before, forgetting the role of the presiding officer or the Speaker of the House is an important pitfall or mistake. Like I said, not waiting to be recognized, or calling for debate or discussion, or trying to lead the discussion of the assembly instead of letting the presiding officer carry out that responsibility. Another pitfall is not following the agenda or the order of business, not having or following rules of debate. Ineffective committee reports is a common pitfall in assemblies, especially when committees aren't given time limits for their report, or those time limits are not enforced. That's a very common pitfall I see in a lot of organizations. And then ineffective record keeping of the meeting or minutes. And we can have a whole nother conversation another day about how to properly take and record minutes. But those are just a few common pitfalls that we want you to avoid as much as possible.
So this is just a reminder to our committee chairs that you have 5 minutes for those committee reports. And we'll be following that really closely. So I'm hoping that our chair or myself don't have to pull on your coattail to let you know that you are now at your time limit. So that's just to make sure our meeting is running effectively, and we have a limited amount of time with quite a bit of business to cover. So we want to really make sure that we're following those time limits, particularly when they've been provided for you guys.
Next slide.
We thought we would just cover just some general topics around voting. So general consent would be unanimous consent. And so I'm going to cover the ones that you're most commonly going to see within our House of Delegates, and that's really the voice vote. The majority of the voting within the House of Delegates in that assembly is really a voice vote. This is our regular method, commonly used for almost any motion that does not require more than the majority. So as Terry said, that there are some places where we need the 2/3 vote. And at that time, we would probably call for a hand or a rising vote. Or if, like, for example, a delegate called for division. So we did a voice vote. It's not clear. A delegate calls for a division. So we would verify that vote with a hand or rising vote. Or if there's, again, an inclusive or non-conclusive voice vote, we use the hand or rising vote. From a ballot vote perspective, most of you guys are familiar with that process. And this is the process in which we utilize for the election of officers. And then a roll call can be ordered by a majority of the delegates. And so this is a place where the delegates can drive our voting process, or it could be specified in the bylaws. So we commonly will do a roll call to set quorum. This is different than a roll call vote. And so I think that's important just to highlight. Of the ones that are listed here, again, what you're going to see at the national meeting in the next couple of weeks is a voice vote, and then either a hand or what we call a rising vote. What was the question around 2/3 versus majority?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I know we discussed different motions and the types of motions. Then when those motions, so like,
Oh, Frank, you're breaking up on my side. I know I have storms moving through. I think you're breaking up for all of us. You want to drop it in the chat?
do that.
And are you asking based on the vote, if it requires a 2/3 versus a majority?
Yes.
Yes, we will provide, it's like a 2-page grid that is laid out. So it will have the vote, the motion. It has, is it debatable or not debatable? And then does it require a majority versus a 2/3 vote? And then I think the last column has some comments just on how you should proceed. For example, how you should bring it to the floor. So that'll be part of the documents that the House of Delegates and our membership receive. And so we can review that. And I think the nice thing about that is that will be a document that will be available within the House of Delegates to just make sure everybody understands what requires a majority versus 2/3. Does that answer your question?
Frank?
Yes, it does.
There was a question about how can you request a private vote. I'm assuming that you mean where people don't want to publicly express their vote. That's what you use a ballot vote for, and a member can call for a ballot vote. Then the assembly would be prepared to conduct it with a ballot vote. Usually then if you're in person, if you don't have like voting machines, then you would have to resort to like a paper ballot. But that's how you can exercise or request votes where people don't have to display publicly how they're voting. And this is our last knowledge check. This series of polling questions, they're all true or false. So just put your answer in the chat and put the number of the question beside it. So we'll be able to distinguish it. So the first is the presiding officer should call the meeting to order and then ask the assembly what they want to talk about, true or false. Question number 2, only the presiding officer can determine when to adjourn a meeting, true or false. 3, standing committees do not have to give reports, true or false. And 4, when someone seconds a motion, it means they agree or support the motion, true or false. So let's see what we have here in the chat. A lot of falses, false, false, false. All of them are false. Okay, let's go to the next slide and see what the answers are. And you all are correct. All of those statements are false. And any questions for Kendrea or Terry at this point?
So I wanted to clarify, hopefully you can hear me now. I'm driving, so I pulled over to, I wanted to make sure that there was an understanding of the weighing of the votes, or how the votes are measured. Like when we talk about action items, so we're going to do this, it's majority. But when we're talking about changing rules or overriding the minorities like like limiting debate or calling for the question and different things of that nature, those are alterations of rules. And so then those require what's called a supermajority, the 2/3. So I thought, so I agree with Dr. Butler. I thought it was great, but I know that sometimes it tricks a person up when they feel like they could just have 51%, but they really need, 67.7 or whatnot percent the in-house rules, or to change version of that individual's right to speak or something of that nature, if that makes sense.
Hey, Terry, do you want to maybe look at some of the questions, and I'll go try to pull that chart and we can just quickly show them what they're going to get so they can orient themselves to this is the chart that you're going to receive and the information that'll be provided.
Yes, that's, so yes, these slides, the presentation and the slides and the recording will be shared, I think with everyone at least who registered, if not more. Let me see what else was in the chat. While I'm looking at the questions, I do want to just thank everyone for attending, for your attentiveness, for your questions, your participation. This is a really important topic in terms of conducting our business as an organization. Let's see, am I missing anything in the chat? Share the presentation. You all are quite welcome. Such kind words. Kendra and I appreciate doing these sessions. And when she has the slides, but if we need to, after she shows this chart, we can go back and make sure everyone has the link to do the evaluation and to get your CE credit.
Can everybody see this document that I have displayed?
Yes.
So what we've done is basically taken the most common motions. And so the first column just is basically telling you what, like trying to guide you as to what are you trying to do within the assembly. So if you're trying to amend a motion, introduce a main motion, refer something to a board or a committee, and then end or close debate. But we also have like point of order, if there's a request for more information, if we need to reconsider a motion, what we call killing a motion. So Terry went over that. So to postpone indefinitely. So we have kind of it broken into this idea around what are you trying to do, what you should say when you come before the House, whether or not you can interrupt or not. And so again, this kind of goes back to some of our discussion around like those priority rules. If a second is needed, if it's debatable, amendable, and then what vote is needed. Question, what we've done in that column is identified, is that a majority or third? And then this last column, if you're unsure of kind of what are you trying to do, we've tried to make sure that we've added some additional bullets or document or information here just around like for example, to amend, we added some language around like exactly what you should say, right? So you want to amend a resolution and you want to be very specific about where you're wanting to insert words or a paragraph, or if you're wanting to strike words. And then if you wanted to, for example, refer a motion to a committee for consideration. So we've added some details in that last column that we hope will be helpful, that further describes that motion and what you're trying to bring before the board or the assembly or House of Delegates. So hopefully, Frank, that answers your question. And hopefully this tool will be helpful for all of the delegates as well as our membership.
And again, when you will get these materials and have time to review them more closely, or if you, you know, are even in the meeting, and please feel free to reach out to me. I know I won't be sitting as the parliamentarian like Kendra will be, because she's there to really assist the Speaker of the House and the presiding officer. But before any of the House sessions or whatever, we will be available if you need some clarification, or if there's something you want to do and you're not sure how to go about it, feel free to stop either of us and we'll be more than happy to try to assist you.
So I think Ron has put this link for the evaluation within the chat.
Yes, there it is.
And so you also will notice here the UAN for those two sessions for pharmacists versus technicians as well. Are there any additional questions?
There is a reminder that the House of Delegates session, the first one, is on Saturday from 10 to 12, and then The second session is Sunday, 4 to 6 p.m. I do see a hand, Dr. McCants.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I do have a quick question. When will the proposed bylaw amendments be available for the delegates to review?
Is Angela still on?
Good evening, everyone. Yes, I am still here. Our goal is to send everything out in the Dropbox format that we have in the past, so everyone will have them available throughout the conference. So again, our goal is to have every single document you will need for review at the latest by Wednesday of next week. So all of the documents both Terry and Kendria talked about today, as well as the resolutions and any bylaw amendment requests that were submitted, will all be accessible via the Dropbox link that will be emailed to the delegates. I hope that answered your question.
It does, thank you.
No problem.
Any other questions? All right. Well, on behalf of our Bylaws and Resolutions Committee and Terry and myself, we thank you guys for joining us. We are excited to see you officially within an in-person House of Delegates, and hope that we continue to have the same lively conversation and discussion that we had when we were meeting virtually over the last couple of years. All right, guys, you guys have a good night.
Take care, be safe.
Thank you.